Every hidden advantage of your disadvantages explained. Left-handed. If you're left-handed, you've probably spent your life losing quiet battles to everyday objects. Scissors feel wrong. Pens smear across your hand as you write. Spiral notebooks turn writing into a negotiation. It's not a big deal. It's just constant. And it's easy to assume that means you're at a disadvantage. But you're not. You're just operating in a world that wasn't designed for you. And that changes how you adapt. Because when most systems are built for right-handed people, you don't get to rely on default patterns. You have to adjust. You flip movements. You mirror instructions. You figure things out without being shown the correct way. And over time, that builds something most people never develop. Flexibility. Not physical, cognitive. In sports, this shows up immediately. Everyone trains against right-handed patterns, so when a left-handed player shows up, everything feels slightly off. Timing is different. Angles don't behave the same. Reactions slow down, just enough to matter. It's not that left-handed people are better, it's that everyone else is slightly unprepared. And that small mismatch creates an advantage. But the bigger shift happens in the brain, because constantly adapting to systems that don't fit forces your brain to stay flexible. You don't just follow patterns, you adjust them. And over time, that strengthens communication between different parts of the brain, especially the ones responsible for coordination and problem solving. Not because left-handed people are special, but because they've had to adapt. Anxiety. You know that person who plans for everything? Extra charger, backup plan for the backup plan. That's anxiety doing its job. It doesn't feel helpful. It feels like your brain refuses to relax, like it's constantly scanning for what could go wrong, even when nothing is wrong. And most people treat that like a flaw, but it's not. It's a prediction system that doesn't turn off, because anxiety forces your brain to run simulations. What if this fails? What if that goes wrong? What did I miss? Over and over, which means you start noticing things other people don't. Small changes, subtle patterns, details that don't quite add up. You catch the hesitation in someone's voice, the problem before it becomes obvious, the risk before anyone else sees it. Not because you're overthinking, because your brain is constantly modeling outcomes, and that creates something useful: preparedness. While everyone else is reacting in real time, you've already thought through 3 different scenarios. Which is why anxious people are often the ones holding things together when something actually goes wrong. They've already been there, mentally. Of course, when it's constant, it's exhausting. And unmanaged anxiety can turn against you. But in controlled amounts, it's awareness, it's foresight. It's the ability to see problems early enough to do something about them. And in the right situations, that's not a weakness, it's an advantage. Baldness. Losing your hair feels like losing control. It's gradual, unpredictable, and very visible. One day it's a little thinner, then suddenly it's not optional anymore. And many people treat that like a downgrade. But perception doesn't work the way people think it does, because when you remove the hair, you remove the variability. No styling, no adjustment, no inconsistency. What's left is a cleaner signal, and people read that differently. Studies have shown that bald men are often perceived as more dominant, more confident, and more authoritative. Same face, same person, different interpretation. Because the absence of hair shifts attention. It puts more focus on structure, facial features, posture, expression, and it removes the softness that hair can add, which is why a shaved head often reads as more intentional, even when it wasn't. There's also a practical side. No maintenance, no bad hair days, no time spent trying to control something that doesn't want to cooperate. It's consistent, and consistency, psychologically, is often interpreted as control. Of course, not everyone chooses it. And for a lot of people, it doesn't feel like an upgrade at first. But over time, what looks like a loss becomes a shift in how you're perceived. You're not any less than, you're just perceived differently. Flat feet. For a long time, flat feet were treated like a built-in disadvantage. Slower, weaker, less athletic. At least, that's how it was framed. But that assumption comes from looking at performance in very specific ways. Speed, explosiveness, vertical movement. Not endurance, not stability, not impact over time. Because structurally, flat feet distribute force differently. Instead of concentrating pressure through a high arch, the foot spreads impact across a wider surface, which changes how force moves through the body. less concentrated stress, more even distribution, better absorption over long periods, and that matters, especially in environments where repetition and durability are more important than short bursts of power. There's a reason older military data found that soldiers with flatter arches often had fewer stress fractures, not because they were stronger, because their bodies handled impact differently. There's also a stability advantage. More surface area in contact with the ground means more balance, more control, less reliance on perfect positioning. You're not bouncing off the ground, you're connected to it. Of course, that comes with trade-offs. You're not built for explosive movement in the same way, but you're built to last. And in the right context, that matters more. Height. If you're shorter than average, you've probably felt it before anyone even said anything. You're taken less seriously, overlooked in groups, sometimes underestimated on instinct. It's subtle, but it's consistent, and it's easy to assume that means you're at a disadvantage. But physically, shorter bodies are built differently. Lower center of gravity, less mass to control, more efficient movement, which makes a difference in how you move through space. You accelerate faster, change direction easier, stay balanced under pressure. That's why many high-level athletes in sports that require agility, gymnastics, martial arts, diving, tend to be shorter, not by accident, because control matters more than reach in those environments. There's also an efficiency advantage. Shorter bodies require less energy to move, less strain on the cardiovascular system, less overall wear over time, which may be one reason studies have linked shorter height to slightly longer average lifespans. Not dramatically, but consistently enough to notice. And then there's perception, because when you're not automatically given authority based on size, you learn to build it in other ways. Communication, timing, presence. You don't rely on physical dominance, you develop behavioral precision, and that tends to be more reliable anyway, because attention isn't something you're given, it's something you learn to control. Introversion. You're in a group setting, and everyone's talking at the same time. Conversations overlap, noise builds, energy keeps rising, and at some point, you're done. Not because you don't like people, because your brain hits a limit, and most people interpret that as a weakness. Quiet, reserved, not engaged enough, but that's not what's happening. Introversion isn't a lack of social ability, it's a difference in how stimulation is processed. Extroverted environments run on constant input, conversation, noise, movement, and introverted brains don't filter that the same way. They process more of it, which means more input, more quickly, with less time to recover. So instead of seeking more stimulation, you regulate it. You step back, you observe, you think before you respond. And that changes what you notice. While everyone else is focused on speaking, you're tracking patterns, tone shifts, word choice, what people say versus what they mean. Which is why introverts are often the ones catching things others miss. Not because they're quieter, because they're paying attention differently. There's also a creative advantage, because when you're not constantly reacting to external input, your brain has space to process internally. Ideas connect, thoughts deepen, patterns become clearer. Which is why many writers, designers, and problem solvers tend to lean introverted. Not always, but often enough to matter. You're not disengaged, you're selective. And in a world that rewards constant output, that ability to pause, process, and respond with intention becomes an advantage. Dyslexia. You're reading a sentence and it doesn't stay stable. Letters shift, words blur together. What should be automatic isn't. So reading takes longer, more effort, more focus, more correction. And most people interpret that as a limitation. But dyslexia isn't about intelligence. It's about processing style. Because instead of decoding language step by step, dyslexic brains tend to process information more globally. Less focused on sequence, more focused on relationships. Which changes what you're good at. You're not as fast at breaking things down line by line, but you're often faster at seeing how things connect. Patterns across systems, structures across ideas, how one piece affects another. That's why dyslexia is often linked to strengths in areas like design, engineering, and spatial reasoning. Not because of compensation, because the brain is wired to prioritize different information. There's also a spatial advantage. Studies have shown that dyslexic individuals can be faster at recognizing complex 3D structures and visual patterns, which matters in environments where understanding systems is more important than reading instructions. So while reading may require more effort, Understanding the bigger picture often requires less. You're not slow, you're processing at a different level of abstraction. And in the right context, that's a strength. Face blindness. You meet someone, have a full conversation, and later you don't recognize them. Not because you weren't paying attention, because your brain doesn't store faces the same way, which most people interpret as forgetfulness or disinterest. But that's not what's happening. Face blindness, prosopagnosia, is a difference in how identity is processed. Because instead of relying on facial recognition, you rely on everything else. Voice, posture, movement, context. You notice how someone speaks, how they stand, how they react, not just what they look like. And over time, that builds a different kind of recognition system. Less visual labeling, more behavioral pattern tracking. You're not remembering faces, you're remembering people, which can actually reduce a common bias most people don't realize they have, judging based on appearance. Because when facial cues aren't the primary signal, other information becomes more important. Consistency, tone, behavior over time. And that changes how you interpret others. You're not relying on quick visual assumptions. You're building a more detailed read. Of course, it comes with challenges, but it also forces a different kind of awareness, not surface level, pattern-based. And in the right situations, that can be more accurate. Most of what people call disadvantages aren't actually disadvantages. They're differences that only look negative in the wrong context. Because the system decides what counts as useful, not the trait itself. So it's not about whether something is a weakness, it's about how it's being interpreted. Which of these felt relatable to you? Tell us in the comments.